Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining me. I want to draw attention to the bit.ly link that is not only here, but it is also in the comments on the GoToWebinar, where I have made a few revisions to the handouts, and you can access them in a folder on that link. As Tim already stated, my name is Heather Miller-Schwartz, and today we will be discussing speech and language disorders that you may see most frequently in your classrooms. I'm a speech-language pathologist, and I've been working with individuals with complex communication needs for 18 years, and 15 of those I've been at Infinitec. One of my areas of interest is augmentative and alternative communication, which you'll hear me refer to as AAC a few different times in this presentation. I have always had an interest in computers and technology because I love how technology can bridge the gap for so many individuals who have speech and language disorders. This was what initially sparked my interest in this area of my field. And as I began to learn more, I was taught that it wasn't necessarily the technology that is always the solution, that there are many forms of AAC that range from increasing our gesture systems to providing visual supports in paper form, and all the way up to those high-tech communication devices that we'll also be discussing next week. I am so excited that you'll be able to hopefully join me as we dive into these topics within the next month or so. And what these include, let me see. We will be meeting every Monday for the next 4 weeks at 10 o'clock and 1 o'clock. There's a repeated session, so there's no need to sign up for both. They will be recorded. The titles are, today we'll be discussing overview of communication disorders. Last week was an overview of communication. If you weren't able to attend that webinar last week, I could send you the handouts. Feel free to reach out to me at hmiller@ucpnet.org. Next week will be an overview of augmentative and alternative communication devices and systems. May 4th, AAC strategies to implement with your AAC users in the classroom. May 11th, we'll talk about a specific strategy of modeling augmentative and alternative communication called partner augmented input. It's one of the best strategies for teaching a second language, and that's basically dual language immersion by modeling on an AAC system. And finally, on May 11th, we'll discuss, actually on May 18th, we'll discuss fading prompts and providing prompts for individuals, not only who use AAC, but just in general in your classrooms. If you'd like to sign up and you haven't received the links, please feel free to email me and I could send those links your way. When I was asked to provide this training for you, I was super excited because you're the ones that these students see every day for the most amount of time. You know the things they like and you often know the things they don't like. You know, especially if your kiddos are nonverbal, what they're telling you when they're making specific gestures or facial expressions about whether they like or don't like something. In this training, I hope to give you a few new strategies that might help you to communicate better with your students. Our goals for our training are to discriminate between an expressive and a receptive language disorder. Actually, just in general, to discriminate between expressive and receptive language, to identify the difference between a delay and a disorder, and also to identify 3 strategies to help with speech and language skills for your particular students in your classroom. I don't know your students personally, and oftentimes in this presentation, you'll hear me asking you to refer back to your speech-language pathologist or your educational team. I want to encourage you to do that because they do know your student, and every student is different. What may work for one student may very well not work for another because each student has different needs and strengths. However, these are general strategies that hopefully will assist you as you're working with the students in your classroom. Again, the purpose of this training is information. It's not to be used as a tool for diagnosis. And again, always refer to your educational team. The Common Core Standards for ELA are a set of shared goals and expectations for knowledge and skills that students need to succeed in college, life, and career. They're a very important tool when it comes to measuring progress in education. And so I've outlined a few different standards and at a few different levels for you to see. In general, the standards that typically can be applied to this presentation are encouraging our students' abilities to answer questions, express ideas, and participate in conversations about educational curriculum. And if you'll see at the bottom of the screen, www.corestandards.org has an exhaustive list of all of these standards as well. Last week, we discussed the typical communication development of children who are speaking. Communication is a process that allows us to transmit a message from one individual to another. It's dynamic, which means that it's always moving and changing, and it's something that could be done in many ways. Also known as multimodal communication. We use many different ways to communicate, and often communicators will use the method of communication that is most appropriate for him or her at that time. Some ways you might see someone communicating might be by gesture, by eye gaze, by body tone, speech and vocal sounds, facial expression, isolated sign language, or full sign language, the full language such as American Sign Language. Sometimes I choose to speak, while other times I may not be able to speak because of the circumstances, and therefore I might use like a facial expression. For example, if my son was about to come in here and talk to me, he'd know right away that I'm on a call or I'm in a training just by the look on my face and the way that my body tenses up. I often supplement with facial expressions, regardless of whether it's necessary, just naturally. If I'm speaking, I want to emphasize what I'm saying by using facial expressions. As we explained in the previous webinar, any one of these systems alone is a form of communication. However, only speech and sign language have the capacity to build a full language. And by a full language, that means that it's a code or a system, and it's a means of communicating. So representing ideas through the use of symbols. So if I wanted a cookie, I might look at that cookie, and that would be communicating to you that I want that cookie. If I ask the question, can I have a cookie? Then I'm using language to let you know that same meaning that I may have communicated to you with my eyes a minute ago. Humans are the only race that have the unique ability to use symbols to communicate. And there are many types of language. There are oral languages, such as English, Arabic, Italian. There are signed languages, like American Sign Language. And there are visual languages, such as writing, or AAC languages, like Word Power Unity, that we'll get into a bit more next time. Last session, we discussed developmental stages of language development. It's helpful to know that usual developmental stages that a child goes through when you're learning speech are just approximations. Remember that developmental stages are ranges. And babies, toddlers, children, they'll achieve different skills at different times within those ranges. To go further with some of the definitions that we discussed last time, receptive language means the ability to understand information. It involves understanding the words, sentences, and meanings of what is communicated or read. Expressive language means to be able to put thoughts into words and sentences in a way that makes sense and is grammatically accurate. It's a transfer of meaning from one individual to another using a rule-based system such as sign language or verbal language. Generally, receptive language develops before expressive language. For a child to be able to communicate and learn, they need to be able to understand spoken language. A child will have difficulty talking or responding to a question logically if they are unable to understand what has been expressed to them. For this reason, it's important that a child is given the opportunity to develop their receptive language skills before focusing on their expressive skills. Providing a child with a language-rich environment is the best way that we could do this. As children improve their language skills, they tend to understand more of what they can say. In other words, receptive language is almost always better than expressive language in young people. Now, the communication disorder definition as given to us by AAC. AAC is our speech and language place to go. It stands for American Speech, Hearing, and Language Association. And you'll see AAC on the bottom of a lot of my slides because that is our place. as speech and language pathologists to get information. And the way that ASHA defines a communication disorder is an impairment in the ability to receive, send, process or understand, and comprehend concepts of verbal, nonverbal, and graphic symbol systems. And that was a lot of words. That just basically means that they have people with language disorders have trouble understanding what others are communicating to them and trouble sharing thoughts, ideas, and feelings. A communication disorder may range in severity from mild to profound. It may be developmental, or it may happen as a result of some incident. For example, if I have a student on my caseload who has been in a car accident, their brain injury may cause a speech and language impairment. And then right next to him, I may have a student who has a developmental disability such as autism. Most people who have receptive language disorders will often have a mixed language disorder, which means it's a combination of both language understanding and language expression. Now, one of our goals for today was for us to be able to understand what the difference is between a language delay and a language disorder. A language delay is when a child's language is developing in the right sequence, but at a slower rate. Delayed speech and language development is the most common developmental problem. It affects 5 to 10% of preschool children. As we're looking at a formal definition, a delay means that a child is developing language in a typical manner, but is doing so more slowly than other children his or her age. A disorder means that a child is not developing language as you would expect or abnormally. And so when you look at an example, I have a son who developed speech slowly. He was able to produce, when we discussed last week about at 2 years old, your kiddo should have about a couple hundred words. My son had about 50. And therefore, he had a delay that I wasn't sure was a delay at the time. But what we found was at 2 years old, when he had 50, by the time he reached nearly 4, he had the same amount of language as other children. He did eventually catch up on his delay. However, at the time, it was hard to tell whether that was a delay or a disorder based on the fact that he didn't have the language that other students his age did or other kids. There's also a language delay due to language deprivation. That occurs due to like a lack of full access to natural language during your critical period of language acquisition. This could be because perhaps the child has been neglected or malnourished. In other circumstances, there are children whose families weren't aware of a deafness, and therefore they're not able to receive that language input in a language that would be something that they're able to comprehend fully and express. So if there is a deaf student who's only being spoken to, then they may have a little bit of a language delay once they start to have their language, because they didn't have the language that was natural for them. Moving on to receptive language disorders. Some students have problems with understanding, also known as receptive language disorders, and there is no specific checklist of symptoms. Signs and symptoms of receptive language impairments vary from student to student. Individuals with receptive language impairments may have trouble understanding what words and gestures mean. They may have difficulties learning new words, identifying objects. So for example, if I hold up an apple and an orange and I say, which one's the apple? They may have a difficult time understanding which one I'm talking about. Following directions, answering questions, or understanding what's read to them, or what they are reading if they're able to read. You might see that the student frequently misunderstands you. For example, I might ask my student, who did you see over the weekend? The student might respond, zoo. Now, he heard details of my question. He heard weekend. He probably heard, maybe even understood see or over the weekend. but didn't quite cue into the question word who. So he's responding to parts of the sentence, but not getting all the details. He might understand definitely that it's his turn to speak. However, he might not get the full meaning of what I'm expressing to him. Other signs and symptoms, you might see a child who's having difficulties achieving in school. It may look like the child understands sometimes, but not others. And this may be because of the cues he is able to pick up from the environment. You may see behavioral outbursts, especially during times when there's a lot of language expected and a lot of language understanding expected. You may also see your student begin to space out or look inattentive. And I always think of when I was enrolled in real heavy duty science classes when I was in college, and it wasn't my major, and I would have a very hard time remaining attentive for that full hour or hour and a half that I was expected to attend. I may have started doodling. I may have started staring out into space thinking about what I was going to do the next day. And that's exactly what you may see in your students. They may tune out or withdraw because they just don't understand and they're not certain about how to respond or even what the lesson's about. You might see a difficulty following directions. The student is only able to follow directions if they're broken down into smaller steps or possibly even supplemented with visual supports. The student may wait to follow directions so he or she can copy what the other students are doing. So they're already developing some of those strategies to help with success. And a little bit more about what we said in the last couple slides ago. Often kids are able to use what's available to them to understand. So students will pick up and often figure out how to take information that they are able to understand and use it to their benefit. So if I'm doing a lesson and I'm very expressive and I'm using a lot of visual supports and a lot of visual cues in my gesture and in my visual skills one day, but then the next day I'm real tired. I'm not I'm not showing as much affect. I may not be using my gestures. I may not have gotten all my visual supports. That next day, my students' variability may be due to me instead of him. And so you may see those inconsistencies, and maybe even if I'm doing the same things day to day, but they're just tired. There's a lot of work for these kids to communicate, and they're using what they can. And a lot of work for them to understand communication. Second language learners are not labeled with language impairments unless they have been diagnosed as having an impairment in their native language. Now moving on, we'll talk a little bit about autism spectrum disorder. Now, autism spectrum disorder itself isn't a speech language disorder, but it makes this list because usually speech and language disorders and autism spectrum disorder go hand in hand. In fact, America's Speech, Hearing, and Language Association have that as one of those defining factors that it makes autism first detectable. Autism spectrum disorder is a developmental disorder that affects communication and behavior. Although autism can be diagnosed at any age, it is said to be a developmental disorder because symptoms generally appear in the first 2 years of life. 1 in 59 children had a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder by the age of 8, reported in a study, or I think it was a census by the Centers for Disease Control in 2014. I love this quote by Dr. Stephen Shore. He stated, "If you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism." And that means while there's a list of communication characteristics that you can use when making a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder, no two students are alike. Each student will have different strengths and different needs. And Dr. Stephen Shore reported in an interview, this quote emphasizes that there is great diversity within the autism spectrum. While the commonalities of people on the autism spectrum include differences in communication, social interaction, sensory perception, and highly focused interests, It's important to understand that the constellation of these characteristics blends together differently for each individual. Students with diagnosed autism spectrum disorder, otherwise known as ASD, will typically have difficulty with receptive language or language understanding. They will typically have difficulties with expressive language as well. Between 30 and 50% of all children with autism do not develop speech. Students diagnosed with ASD may exhibit some of the following characteristics. They may have difficulty with communication and interaction with other people. You may see restrictive interests and repetitive behaviors and activities. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. They also may have abnormal responses to environmental stimuli. So they might not respond the same way as you or I to noises in the background, to the fluorescent lights that they're seeing. People with ASD have difficulty with social communication and interaction. They have restricted interests and repetitive behaviors. The list below gives some examples of the types of behaviors that are seen in people diagnosed with ASD. Not all people with ASD will show all behaviors, but most will show several. So for example, you may see inconsistent eye contact. The kiddo may appear not to be looking or listening to others. They may be slow to respond to their name, or they may show no response at all. They may show difficulties with social turn-taking. They may repeat chunks of language or repeat questions or use complex sentences before even naming objects. And this is all called echolalia, which is going to be in our next section. Basically, our students are remembering whole chunks of language and reusing those chunks when they're using echolalia expressively and communicatively. And we'll talk a little bit more about that next. You'll also notice that a lot of students with autism will use abnormal prosodics. Now, prosodics was a term we discussed last time in our last webinar. And what that means is the intonation of my speech, the spacing of my speech, the rise and falls for emphasis or for indicating whether it's a question or a statement or an exclamation. Often that could be a little bit abnormal and actually could range to be a lot abnormal for individuals with autism. Individuals with ASD may exhibit lasting, intense interests in certain topics, such as numbers, details, or facts. They also may have overly focused interests in moving objects or parts. They may discuss favorite subjects at length, and they may fail to recognize when other people are not interested in those favorite topics. Especially while they're talking about their favorite topics, they may not give others a turn in conversation when discussing those topics. In an interview by Autism Live, they discussed this perseveration, and it was really helpful for me to see this.
We've had several viewers write in about perseveration, and it seems like it's one of those things that some of our kids participate in. Maybe we should start with a definition of what perseveration and perseverative behavior, and believe me, that's a mouthful, is.
Well, great. Thanks for putting me on the spot. I'm not sure if there really is. I'm not familiar with any official definition.
Okay.
But basically, what it looks like is individuals who are interested in the same topic or the same theme or the same character or the same movie or toy over and over and over, and they persevere in that. That's where perseverative comes from.
Right.
Persevere in that interest to the detriment, to the extent that it gets in the way of other aspects of their daily life. Is I think one way to sum it up.
Some of the things that I think of in my mind, because I'm so visual, I think of like when the old record with the needle.
Yeah.
It's not the best reference for those of you who are younger, but a record could get stuck in one groove and play over and over again. And the other thing that somebody told me once is that, you know how when people fall in love and there's that slice of time when that's all that's happening for them.
Yeah.
That sometimes our kids, it's like that sort of, it's all about whatever this thing is.
Exactly.
Which is also like being stuck, but they don't move out of it later on. So I think that what I'm hearing from a lot of parents, and I've experienced this myself, is that you look at that and it's frustrating.
Right.
It bugs you on a level that isn't human, right? Right?
Yeah,
Where you go, this is not rational how badly I'm being bugged by the fact that I can't get my child out of this. It's just like, because you feel helpless and hopeless.
Right.
And that's really the crux of it, that we don't know, is this going to end, and how to make that quicker to get to the end.
Right, right. And so I would suggest that a healthy view of perseveration or perseverative behavior is not that it's a bad behavior that you want to go away, although that is your first reaction, right? As a parent and as a family member, basically you just want, you basically want to say, quit it, cut it out, right?
And we have.
And
we've tried that. And that didn't work, by the way.
Right?
It did not work.
Doesn't work.
No.
So that's one view, that you can view it as a bad behavior that you want to go away. But another perspective that you can have also is that your child or your family member, your client or your student, whoever it is, just has a really extreme interest in this and has an overall pattern of having extreme interests in stuff generally. Okay. So some people have a lot of variability in their interests, right?
Yeah.
And they try new things all the time, new foods all the time, new music all the time, new hobbies all the time, right? And others not so much. And they really stick with one particular hobby or interest or food or what have you. So kids who have a lot of perseveration are like the former, or sorry, like the latter, where they're really interested in one thing over and over. Now, in some ways, that's a strength. I mean, most people who are really high-level performers in whatever they do, whether it's a star athlete, a star computer programmer, a star musician, they don't do a lot of different stuff. They do that one thing and they do it to the extreme, and they do it perfectly. Almost.
They become
masters, right? So let's just be reasonable here and take out the value judgments for a second and sit back and say, well, maybe my kid's kind of a master at loving Thomas the Train or whatever it is.
I typically don't have videos going for that long. However, that description of having a student who has an intense interest in something and looking at it, it's similar to me when, let's say, I had my first child. All I could think about was that child. I wanted to talk about that child all the time. I dreamt about that child. I was so in love with that child. And looking at it from that perspective makes it less abnormal. It makes it something that actually could be viewed as a positive. My student, if we could shape those interests or use those interests to our benefit, it could really be helpful. If I know my student likes Thomas the Train, I can make sure that a lot of materials have Thomas the Train, and that way they're going to be more interested in the materials that I'm introducing to them. If you can use some visual reminders, we could help to shape those so that we can encourage that healthy interest in their activity of choice, but then try and shape that into something that could be useful down the line. I lost my place, excuse me. Individuals with autism spectrum disorder may become upset with changes in routine. They may have decreased or increased sensitivity to sensory input, such as light, noise, clothing, and temperature. They also often have sleep problems, and because of this may have more irritability than your other students. These are all things to keep in mind, because when you see some of the behaviors that are exhibited with students with autism, or if you see some of those increased repetitive behaviors, it may be due to the fact that they're trying to cope with some of these sensory differences that they're feeling. They may be trying to cope with the fact that they don't understand why their schedule has changed, or that it's too loud in the room, or there's too much light, or that there's a scratchy tag on their shirt. And so they're looking at all those sensory inputs can help us when when creating an environment that promotes communication. On the other hand, individuals with ASD may exhibit tons of strengths. They're often very, if you'll allow me to overgeneralize, they're often very good in topics that are very concrete, such as math, science, and music. They may be able to learn things in detail and remember information for long periods of time. I've had students that I've met years ago where I walk into their classroom for another student, and that one student that I met years ago remembered my name and my birth date. So some wonderful skills in memory, visual skills, and often good auditory learners. Some have wonderful auditory memories. I'd like to give you a quote, and it is a little bit on the longer side, from Judy Endow, called about autism as a difference versus a disability. From her words, many autistic adults would like it if autism were recognized as a difference rather than a disability. Many in this group are walking, talking autistics. We go out in public by ourselves. Some of us are parents. We are your friends, neighbors, and coworkers. We might seem to be a bit odd, but we can fit in enough to at least be all owed a place in the world at large. Even so, being out and about in the community poses significant challenges. The sensory overload and neurological processing differences dictated by our brain, along with ever-present challenges with communication and conventional social understanding, are such significant differences. Even though we can accommodate for them, we are usually exhausted from doing so by the end of the day. But because our autism is so visibly noticed, along with the significant supports we often need, people make other sorts of assumptions about us. Our needs are so obvious that people do not always consider that we also have strengths and abilities along with likes and dislikes. Often we are placed in menial jobs as adults, and our support staff is switched around as if people are interchangeable and relationships do not matter to us. We are not often seen as people who have preferences, desires, abilities, skills, and talents, as the time and energy of others are focused on the meeting deficits and needs imposed by our disability. At this time, I would love to have comments about that statement or anything, and also take a minute for questions before we move on to strategies.
I do have just a couple questions. Understand if the teacher is not fluent in English, like is there a fluency with the teacher's part that might affect how the student is learning to speak?
I would say that absolutely, and the same way that an accent that I'm not familiar with is would be more difficult for me to understand, it would be the same for our students. There are a lot of ways that we could supplement that by having more visual supports, by if there is something that your staff member or friend is saying that you know your student might not understand, to ask for repetition or things like that to help to bridge that gap. I think that probably answers the question.
Okay, and then I just one other question. I have a student who seems to be playing video games and watching a movie in her head. So she's wondering if screen time can affect receptive language.
I'm not sure if screen time is actually what's causing that to occur. That might be, there's a lot of reasons why those repetitions occur. They call that delayed echolalia or scripting. One reason that could be occurring would be because that's calming for your student. She's thinking of a time that she enjoyed, and so if the sensory input is too high, or if the task is challenging, or if she doesn't want to do that at that moment, you may see an increase in scripting. It's usually, I can't say definitively because I don't know the student and how much screen time she particularly is receiving. I can't say that that's a causative relationship. It may be other factors that are involved.
Awesome. Those were the only two questions I had, so we can move on.
Thank you. Well, then we'll move on to some receptive language strategies. Now, these receptive language strategies may be helpful to your students who are on the autism spectrum, but may just be a pool of strategies that you can pick from when you are trying to help your student to understand the world around them. Please always communicate with your speech pathologist to determine which strategies that he or she would like you to implement with your particular student. This is just a general list of ideas. So first, allow students extra time to listen, think, process, and form their own thoughts about what is written or spoken as part of the material in the classroom. A lot of times our students just need a little extra time in order to take in what's been communicated to them. If I'm noticing that my student is giving me some of those signs and symptoms that he's not understanding me, I will count in my head before I either repeat the question or move on. I'll communicate using shorter and more direct sentences. You may want to break down longer directions into smaller sections. You may eliminate non-essential words and phrases, and limit the use of negatives, sarcasm, and figurative language. There have been studies that have shown that telling a student, don't do that, oftentimes the student hears the last part and they don't even hear the don't. That could be just because they're tuning in after you've started speaking and they miss that no or don't. But there's also studies that show that that immediate aversion kind of blocks that word out. So one strategy to use when you have a student who has a difficult time processing negatives like no or don't is to always frame your directions positively. Instead of saying, don't hit, say something along the lines of, let's use nice, quiet hands or nice hands. Sarcasm and figurative language are a higher level processing skill. Using those, I think of those jokes that I always have to explain to my children that have double meanings and things. Those are difficult for a lot of people to understand, and especially individuals who are on the autism spectrum or just having language, receptive language difficulties in general. Similar comprehension problems can occur in reading if you are working with a student who does read. So some strategies you could do for comprehension of things that are written would be to encourage the student to summarize what he or she is reading, and also to help the student to recognize and highlight the most important parts of reading assignments so that they could focus their energy of comprehending those particular parts. Often our students may need help understanding what they don't understand, especially individuals who are on the autism spectrum. My student might not recognize that he didn't understand my question, and so he might go along with his day after answering a what did you do over the weekend instead of who did you see, not even recognizing that there was a problem. Not only do they not they may have some of those language deficits that are impacting, but oftentimes our kiddos, especially on the spectrum, aren't paying attention to the visual cues that they're receiving. If I have a confused look like, what, wait, what, I asked you who? They may not look at my face and identify that that's something that they should be tuning into, that I'm giving them a cue by that confused expression on my face. So helping to point out those things, oftentimes when my students are talking to a peer and the peer does give that face, stopping the interaction and being like, oh, look at Johnny over there. His face looks confused. I can tell that because of this is how his eyes look and this is what his mouth is open and he's giving you a confused look. I don't think he understood you. Look at how he looks when he doesn't understand you, and being very concrete about identifying that. Students may need to get extra clarification, and a lot of individuals, especially who have language impairments, will have a difficult time initiating at those times. And so giving them that little prompt in order to ask and advocate for themselves when they don't understand. Multisensory teaching approaches are always helpful when teaching any student. We talked a little bit about this in our overview of communication seminar or webinar, and that is that I am a very auditory learner. However, my mother, visual all the way. And so with me, what I like is that I will listen first and then I might look later. And so having those multiple modes of learning really helps me to comprehend, because visually, if I'm just given something visually, I'm not automatically able to process that. I need to really have it hammered in auditorily, and our kids are no different. They have strengths in learning styles, and so providing multiple learning styles could be very helpful. So not only visual presentation like worksheets, you doing lessons on the smartboard or using visual supports, but also using the spoken word or using music or rhythm or poems for our hearing students. Kinesthetic approaches, which means doing to learn. So using manipulatives and demonstrations and science projects. Those can all be helpful in helping our students to understand content in the classroom. I'm looking at this, and it may be a bit of a repetition, but a very important one. Be aware of potential sensory issues in the individual's environment. Consider visual input, for example, fluorescence or bright lights. Consider auditory input, like loud noises. Consider just background noise, or even sometimes kiddos can hear the lights or hear the lesson in the next room if they're very sensitive with their hearing. Consider tactile input, like certain surfaces, textures, fabrics. Smells and tastes, small perfumes and certain food textures may be bothersome to individuals, and that may impact their ability to listen and learn. My son, when people write with pencils, and the pencil, I actually haven't really pegged it yet, but sometimes it squeaks and he cannot be in the room. It's like a nail on the chalkboard. He could hear that so solidly, and he honestly cannot attend when that happens. And it was happening for a long time before he even brought it up to me. So I don't know how much language was lost during those academic periods when people were writing with pencils in the past. Now, also, some students crave sensory input. And so in order for them to achieve a normal day of learning, they need breaks where they're able to run around, or they're able to have textures, or they're able to have pillows stacked up on top of them. Your best friend when identifying sensory needs for your student is going to be your student's occupational therapist or an occupational therapist on your team. And I urge you to go to them if you're seeing that your student seems to have some difficulty with filtering out or needing some of that sensory input throughout the day. Other things that can help for students with language disorders are to use visual supports. Visual supports are anything that we see that could supplement what we're trying to teach our student. For example, using gestures, body language, affect, and using things around the environment like logos and a tree when you're going to school as your marker to turn left. Objects, photographs, line drawings, texts, these could all be used in order to support auditory presentation of materials. Auditory information goes away, but visual supports remain for longer periods of time. And this also is very true of sign language. Sign language moves quickly, and so having visual supports that remain static can help to have be a reference for our students to support that understanding of language that they're hearing or seeing. Now, visual supports are crucial when educating individuals who have a diagnosed autism spectrum disorder. And why is that? Because of those aforementioned abnormal responses to environmental stimuli. If I am affected by the way that the environment sounds or feels or looks or smells, I may not be able to hear that language at that time. But if that is removed, if all of a sudden we turn down the lights, I could go back and refer to my visual support or my symbol supported learning or my text supported learning in order to regain that information that I may have lost at that time. Students also may have difficulties with auditory and language processing and impairments in expressive or receptive language. So again, everyone uses visuals daily to increase success. I think back at all the visuals I've already used today. I have my phone where I keep my calendar. I set automatically, I have to call someone for their birthday. So I set an alarm, and when that alarm goes off, I'm going to have no idea why that alarm went off, but I'm going to be able to look and see, oh, call Joey for his birthday. I use checklists and lists when I'm going to the grocery store, or even my running checklist of things that I need to do for work. When I'm answering emails, if I need to answer my email, I will not get rid of it in my inbox if there's something that I need to do. So I use my emails as a visual support. And so I'm using visual supports all day. I use my calendar all day. Even though I usually know my schedule, I still rely on my calendar. And that means that our kiddos, even though you may think they know what's going to be happening throughout the day, they may also find comfort in keeping their visual supports. I know that there are some times when we think they don't need those anymore. They know their schedule. However, that could be used for a lot of different tools throughout the day, such as if they are perseverating on one of the topics, having that visually in front of them and saying, no, that you're talking about science. Science comes here in your schedule, and we're right here. And so the schedule could be used to reduce anxiety. It tells my student and reminds my student when they're going to be doing things. Now this actually, it looks like a task schedule, but I've seen schedules like this where I have first is math, then is reading, then is writing. And so my student knows exactly when during the day he's going to be doing that. If there's something that he doesn't like doing, he can prepare for it on his schedule by looking at it on his schedule. It clearly defines our tasks that we're doing, and it clearly defines when we're going to do them and that transition between tasks. Another visual support that can help is the first then or when then. When we were talking about students who perseverate, that's oftentimes because, well, there could be a lot of reasons. However, sometimes I've had students perseverate on something because they don't necessarily want to talk about what we're talking about right now, at least not as much as that other topic that they really, really like. And so having it in writing that first, we're going to do math. And then you can tell me all about trains for 5 minutes. We could refer back to that as our visual. You could just point to the visual as a reminder instead of having to remind them verbally. And if you see at the bottom, I've heard these called if-then boards, but it's been recommended now to use more like first then or when then, because if-then suggests that they have a choice that, you know, maybe if you do math, then we could read. But if we say first, we have to do math, then it sets that expectation. Other visual supports would be tab boards. And now I know these seem like behavioral supports, and in a lot of ways they are. However, if I am anxious, me as a person who is not on the spectrum, if I'm anxious about something, I have a hard time thinking and communicating about the task at hand. If I'm nervous about this presentation that is happening right now, an hour ago when my child was asking me about my day, I may have a harder time listening and formulating because I'm thinking about this. And so giving our students visual supports to refer back to can help to reduce some of that anxiety and help them to open up that brain power towards functional learning. So if I'm doing math, and I know I'm doing math, but I have no idea how much longer I have to do this dreaded math, I may be less willing than if I know I just have 5 left. This is a train visual that I used for one of my students who loved trains. And so we just set up as many tabs. We'd have these X's that we'd cross off. So he was actually physically putting the X's on the train to tell me how many more. And when he saw that, he's like, okay, great. I know exactly how many more I could do this. But if you leave it open, it's like, well, it could be 2, but it could be 50. I don't want to participate in this. I'm done now. So you'll also see token economies and reinforcement charts. These can also help in that same manner of knowing how long we're staying on task before we get that reminded reinforcement that's right on our sheet. Another tip that helps with communication and understanding are visual supports that come in the way of stories. This is an example of a story that one of my former employers put together for waiting in the waiting room for therapy. It talked about having to wait. It talked about what sometimes I do when I need to wait. Sometimes it's hard to wait. Sometimes when I need to wait, I try and run. That makes mommy very frustrated when she has to chase after me. But here is what I can do. And so we're teaching in a story. And in some kids, for example, my kiddo I told you about before, I may make Thomas be the one that's waiting, Thomas the train, so that we could bring in those interests. But social stories and stories in general can help to teach concepts, but they can also use those students' interests to talk about scripting for appropriate language skills, for helping students to understand what they're learning in class if they're broken down into simpler language in a book that you have provided for them. Other things that can be helpful would be tips for visual supports. If I am talking to my students all day and saying, quiet mouth, quiet mouth, quiet mouth, and my student has an auditory processing disorder or a receptive language disorder where he has a hard time understanding, he's wasting a lot of brain power listening to me say quiet mouth. He's processing that every time. He's taking that energy in a way that he could instead be using for another learning skill or a listening topic for listening. Visual supports can serve to help to save that, but also can just make a very nice concrete way of allowing us to show our students what is expected in a visual way as another mode of presenting this for your student. Someone asked in the last session about where you could get some visual supports, and there's lots of different places that you can go. Teachers Pay Teachers has a lot of visual supports. There's also a part of our Infinitec website where you can go in if you are an Infinitec member and look at our resources section and obtain a variety of different, there's a lot of links for visual supports that you could download from the internet. However, I would encourage you to discuss with your team any visual support that you would want to present to your students, so you make sure that it's very consistently used across people and environments. So those were just a variety of visual supports to talk about. This is taken straight from the zones of regulation to talk about how kids are feeling and levels of alertness, they call it, labeling emotions. You could use visual supports to discuss scripts for when kids are frustrated or a checklist for what to do when they're frustrated. You can have sentence starters. There's all kinds of things that could be very helpful for language skills and visual supports. So let's move along to a quick stop for questions about visual supports, and then we'll move on.
I don't necessarily have one about visual supports, but just what are some strategies to implement for students that require supports, but they are in a group or a class of general students that don't know about their disability? And so like if they need more time to answer, but everybody else answers really quickly, what are some strategies to kind of let the other students know without avoiding confidentiality and those kinds of things?
Well, I think that getting the parent involved and having an introduction session, I've seen places where they have had the parent come in and discuss the student so that the kids know the needs and the strengths of the student before coming in. Some parents or staff members have put together a slideshow with the parent permission so that they can talk to the students about that. Coaching the students about how to be a good communication partner, and also coaching the teacher about how to be a good communication partner, because it's really hard sometimes to remember when you have a full class. So I think those good examples that we set for our kids about how to wait could be helpful, and a lot of times they just don't know that that's something that they have to do. Another thing that you can do is provide support to your student. So for example, if you're in the class and you are going to be having a pool of questions, to do some pre-teaching so that they know the sorts of questions that are going to be asked so that they can begin to formulate the answer to their question. You could also have the teacher and the student be in cahoots where she's going to tell him exactly the question that he's going to answer so that he has the opportunity to research for that question, but then also is able to generate that in a timely manner, but also reduces some of that on the spot pressure of needing to generate that language right there. And so they have that time that they could practice it, and then they'll be able to listen better to the others that are offering suggestions or offering answers throughout that class period, because they're not totally worried about what they're going to be asked. But we are going to actually move next to echolalia to give you a little bit more information. Oftentimes, even though echolalia appears to be an expressive language disorder, it's actually very heavily based as a receptive language disorder. When my student is repeating all those things that I'm saying, I know that they're not understanding what I'm telling them. Some echolalia is communicative, so oftentimes there is a reason behind the echolalia. But sometimes the echolalia is not communicative, which means that my student may just be using that echo just to what they call stim or calm themselves or engage in a conversation with themselves that is exciting or happy for them. So individuals with echolalia may, for example, actually, I lost my place again. So I'm not going to go to these videos, unfortunately, because I'm running low on time, and I know we have a lot more to speak about. So here are 2 examples, and you have the full handout if you went to that link, that will give you examples of what delayed and immediate echolalia are. So with immediate echolalia, I might have a student that I have a cookie, and I say, would you like a cookie? And the student says cookie. Now that could be many things. Would you like a cookie? Cookie. That might mean, yes, I want a cookie. If he repeats cookie, but starts crying, that might mean, no, I don't want a cookie, I want something else. Or down the line, my student might exhibit something called delayed echolalia. So maybe down the line, he sees that container of cookies and he looks to me, and I haven't said anything to him, but he might say, do you want a cookie? Almost prompting me to ask that question. He's chunked that language as his way of asking for that cookie. And so that's an example of delayed echolalia and how that might be used to request. Now, all kiddos who speak do go through a period of natural echolalia, and it usually begins at 18 months. And you'll notice that your 18-month through 3-year-old kiddo who's naturally developing language will start to echo you, and that will peak at around 30 months. However, in students with autism particularly, and other developmental disorders, not as commonly, but it is present in other developmental disorders, is that they will do it more frequently, and echolalia will last beyond that 3 years of age. Now, something to know is that echolalia is not necessarily a behavior that needs to be eliminated, and that's because a student who's repeating has the raw material for generating language. So if a student is repeating verbal skills, their verbalizations, that means that they have speech skills. They're able to put their articulators together to make speech. If the person is repeating signs, then they have the motor skills to create signs. And so they just might not be processing language at the same level, but they are able to verbalize or create the building blocks of language. So students who do have echolalia, we could use that. And one way we could do that is to identify the purpose of the echolalia. So we were just talking about a few different purposes. There's sometimes that echolalia is communicative, and mostly it is. If you and your team could identify the reason behind their echoing, then you can offer alternatives for them to repeat. So I say, would you like a cookie? And they repeat, cookie? I might model back to them, I want a cookie. Or yes, I'll take a cookie. And because they will echo me, they just repeated what I wanted them to say. Now, the drawback is that I'm not there to always offer that immediate verbal cue, and I can't train every question ever asked. But it is one thing that you can use as a strategy. Again, with echolalia, along with any other speech and language strategy, a lot of times your speech and language pathologist has a ton of things up her sleeve, so please refer to her or him and their guidance with this. Another thing that they notice about individuals with echolalia is that they are processing language in chunks. My student, when he said, would you like a cookie, to ask for a cookie, he thought of that whole sentence as one meaningful unit at that moment. He wasn't recognizing that that sentence possibly had more than one component, that those words that were in that sentence were independent words from one another. And that's like a big word for that is gestalt processing. And so using a visual support such as this communication board can help with that. So when I speak to my student, I point to the words, number one, it's going to help with receptive language because I'm offering another mode, I'm offering a visual mode. Number two, I'm showing the parameters of each word, that these are individual words that I'm putting together. And so often using augmentative and alternative communication, such as this core board, could be a very effective method at helping with echolalia. Echolalia tips for staff. This actually is a wonderful video that we're not going to go to. This woman talks about scripting, and in this video, she specifically talks about scripting as those kiddos who do repeat, but those kids who are using those repetitions as stimming. And so by that, one of her biggest things that she talks about is one of the biggest reasons behind, or one of the biggest ideas for remediation is if you have a student who is doing a lot of that verbal scripting, is to take a look at what's going on at the time. Now, you very well might have a student who is scripting all day long. And in those cases, I'd take a look at the environment still. But oftentimes you have students who are scripting more in certain environments over the other. Taking a look at those environments and identifying what could possibly be causing that can be very helpful in figuring out how to lessen or shape that echolalia that's not communicative. So for example, if I'm doing an activity that's really hard, or there's a lot of language, I might see an increase in that scripting. Perhaps that's my cue to offer shorter sentences, longer pauses in between, and more visual cues. If I see that my student is doing a lot of scripting, it also might be my cue to talk to my occupational therapist and ask her how, it might just be because he's overstimulated and needs a sensory break of some sort. And so speaking to our occupational therapist to look at it for that reason as well. So we'll move on to expressive language disorders. An expressive language disorder is a person who has an expressive language disorder may be able to understand what others communicate, but have difficulty when trying to express him or herself using language. This disorder can also affect written language. They're caused by a lot of things, but one thing to keep in mind is that an expressive language disorder may be caused by some physical reason that means that their receptive language is largely intact. Oftentimes, our individuals with expressive language disorders have typically developing receptive language skills. So the best rule of thumb is that you always presume competence. Presume that your student is able to understand you, even if he's showing no reason for you to believe that, because he very well could be. Students with expressive language disorders may have difficulties with using gestures, naming objects, word finding, and I give that example of a couple times during this session when I knew there was a word that I wanted to say and it was on the tip of my tongue. There are individuals who have that all day long, and it's very frustrating for me when it's just one word here and there. Asking questions and formulating questions, using the correct words in speech, retelling stories, and you may see individuals having trouble putting the words together in sentences. They might be good at one-word utterances, but once you move to longer, it may be more difficult. They may exhibit improper use of words in their meanings. They might have difficulties expressing ideas. They might have incorrect grammatical patterns. They might use the same phrase over and over again. They might have difficulty knowing how to start a conversation and keep it going. Some tips would be to, first of all, communicate with your team and see what strategies they'd like to focus on. But others would be to encourage parents to communicate with the child in the language that the parents know best. We talked a little bit about this in our last webinar together, but it's important to understand that kids will use their native language as the building blocks for what they're going to build on when they're learning a second language. So the best thing that parents can do is to work very, very hard to have that solid basis to build on when they're coming to school and speaking English if they're speaking a different language at home. And at school, communicate with your student in the language that you expect them to use and provide good models. This includes speaking to them or using their AAC device in the classroom as in addition to your spoken language or signed language. So AAC is in effect a second language, and so using those models and providing those good models on their systems could be very helpful. Give your student time to formulate without interruptions. And be honest. If you don't understand your student, provide those natural consequences and respond to what they do say, and maybe say something like, I know you said something about cars, but I just don't understand what else you were trying to tell me. Can you help me? Respond to the intended message and provide a correct model on your own, in your own speech or sign, or using your own AAC system. This is very important because a lot of these students have language errors all day long. And if every time they have an error, somebody's asking them to say it again, that's going to make language be a task to complete instead of a natural back and forth. That's going to be frustrating instead of rewarding. And so identifying those times when maybe you might want them to repeat, but then often just if you know what they meant, respond and provide models is often a great strategy. And then repeat back what you do understand. Some speech disorders that you might encounter are speech sound disorders, such as articulation impairments. So saying wat instead of rat. Fluency disorders, so that is also called stuttering. And then there's resonance and voice disorders. So we're not going to talk a lot about voice or resonance disorders, and that's because so many of these are based upon medical reasons. So if you have a student who has a voice disorder, it may be because of a nodule or a growth on their vocal cord. It may be because of acid reflux. It may be because of a neurological disease, or it could be because of misuse. You might hear harsh voice, a voice that's too loud, a voice that's too quiet. Oftentimes, treatment is provided through direct services. And it could be any etiology and they're so different that this is one that I would just refer you back to your speech language pathologist to see what she would recommend. Some things that she might say would make sure that your student has periods of vocal rest, having reminders to not overuse their voice or speak, or those vocal charts that'll enable kids to see on a visual support what levels of voice they're using. I've seen the number 5 being the playground voice, and number 1 being the classroom voice, and practicing those different vocal volumes in the classroom and using that as a visual support could be an effective tool. Encouraging your kids to get closer to their communication partners and reinforcement are also too that you can use. Now there's also students that have resonance disorders. Resonance is the way that your voice goes through either your mouth or your nose. And to give an example, if everybody says the sound as like an S or as in snake, that sound goes entirely through your mouth. But if you say the as in mom, sound, that entirely goes through your nose. And some students may or may not be able to have successful resonance. Oftentimes that's also due to medical reasons. You may have a student who has a cleft lip palate. Oftentimes individuals who are deaf or who have deafness or who are hard of hearing lack auditory feedback, and they're having abnormal resonance because of an inability to learn nasal and oral contrasts and later monitor that resonance. So a lot of times I will go back and talk with my SLP about how to manage and how to assist with this in the classroom. Articulation disorders are characterized by substituting sounds like wat for rat, omitting sounds like at for rat, distorting sounds. So if I'm saying the word sip, but I say a real slushy sip, that might be an articulation disorder. Or adding sounds, like instead of play, I might say play, and that often happens with those blends. Other speech sound disorders could be a whole category of sounds. So for example, if I have sounds like S or F that are supposed to be continuous sounds, my student might be doing something called a phonological process where he might stop at that sound. So instead of sit, he might say dit, and that is more of a pattern, excuse me, more of a pattern of error instead of a specific sound. Most children make some mistakes as they're learning new words, and a speech sound disorder occurs when mistakes continue past a certain age. And there are certain ages and ranges for all speech sounds. Here's an example if you wanted to watch this video of a student with a speech sound disorder. One thing that you'll notice is that if you have a student who's in your class, he may have an error of 1 or 2 sounds, such as saying W for R. Here's some examples, or W for L. And if that student is not, if his education isn't impacted, so for example, if he's reading and writing and learning and everyone in the class can understand him, he may not receive school-based services, and that is well within the educational law because it's not impacting educational development. So some tips for staff are first to speak with your speech path or your educational team. But one thing to do would be to model clear articulation, repeat the correct production. So my particular son, one of my sons says F instead of TH, and pretty much all THs, he substitutes something for TH. And so when he says something, like if he's saying the number 3, I'll really emphasize and point to my mouth when I'm saying it. Oh, did you mean 3? And I'll repeat it correctly and maybe emphasize it a little so that he sees that, yeah, this is how you're supposed to say it, but I'm not making you say it every time that you say it wrong, because that would be a long, long day. Stress words that contain the student's target sound. Praise correct sound productions. If the student is going to be reading out loud, it could be really helpful for the student to underline the target sound in their passage so that they have that little visual cue to remember to say those sounds. Also, a great tip that I heard was for you to emphasize the letter instead of the letter sound instead of the letter itself. So for example, saying, oh, instead of a TH sound, saying, oh, say the th, that has a th sound instead of that as a TH sound, or that is a sh sound instead of an SH sound. Ask for a repetition of the target sound sometimes, and also visual cues are really helpful. Providing a visual cue like a gesture by your mouth. I always point to my top teeth when I'm helping my son to say THs, but I've put little snakes on people's desks or little visual cues that I could just point to. I think that does worlds for those kids who are in the gen ed environment who really don't want you to draw attention to the fact that they're speaking differently for social reasons. So having that somewhere that you could quickly point to, maybe inside the desk, so that you can provide that cue without embarrassment. Another great tip is to have the student tell you the number of times they hear someone else produce that sound. That could be distracting for other students, so of course speak with your team and see when this would be appropriate, but having the student identify the correct production of sounds is one way that research has shown can impact their own production, is when they recognize that. Moving on, and I feel like I'm running out of time again, but fluency disorder is an interruption of the flow of speech, and it's also known as stuttering. Disfluencies are normal between 18 months and 3 years. So you'll see a lot of kids repeating whole words when they're learning language, and they'll do a lot of those and well, and those vocal fillers are also very normal. However, stuttering is something that you'll start to see anytime between the age of 18 months and 7 years, usually between 3 and 5 years, and you'll see a higher frequency of repetitions overall than their developing peers, as well as initial consonant repetition. So mommy instead of mommy, 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 the whole word, they'll do parts of the word. If your student has a severe stuttering impairment or a fluency impairment, you will have the student begin, they could be mild for years, it could appear suddenly without mild stuttering, and this is what I was talking about with the associated behaviors. These students begin to react to their stuttering with facial expressions. There'll be a physical struggle. You might see some physical tension in their mouth and in their neck in attempts of hiding their stuttering. You'll also see an avoidance of speaking often, or even avoidance of certain sounds. A lot of these kids figure out which sounds are harder for them to produce fluently, and therefore what you'll see is that instead of saying the word big, because B is a word that I often get hung up on, I might say large. I'll be starting to find words without my trigger sound. So some tips. Number one, don't tell your student to slow down or just relax. And I gave the example in the last webinar that if I'm speaking with someone and they're just like, why don't you relax? I immediately get more tense. And I'm like, wait, I didn't realize I wasn't relaxed. Am I not relaxed? Why do they think I'm not relaxed? And then all of a sudden, I'm much more tense than I was before. So reminding your student to calm down or just relax often does the opposite for your students, and it doesn't help with fluency. Don't complete their sentences for them, and also help to remind the class that everybody needs to take turns and listen. You communicate with your student in an unhurried way. Being an example of pausing frequently and speaking slowly is the best way for your students to speak slowly and pause frequently. Convey that you're listening to the content of the message, and don't make stuttering something that's a stigma or something they're afraid to talk about. Talk about it just like any other matter. You may also have students who are selectively mute, which means that they do not speak in certain situations. If you're encountering this student, their situation is probably school. However, kids who have selective mutism will often they're fully communicative in one environment, but then the other one, there's a refusal. And oftentimes that is not necessarily a refusal. It's an anxiety disorder. It's not something that they're choosing not to do. It's a form of extreme social phobia. And so selective mutism is different from mutism, because people with mutism never speak, whereas selective mutism, they are able to speak, but their phobia or their anxiety is getting in the way of their ability to speak in one environment. So some things that you can do is preferential seating, allowing the use of nonverbal communication, doing one-on-one work, working with them using AAC as a short-term solution, accept and reinforce any form of communication, have everything be fun with no pressure to speak. Oftentimes pairing them with a buddy, you may find that they're whispering to a classmate out on the playground. Pairing them with that classmate can be helpful. Doing small group instruction, developing a warm and supportive relationship, even if it's just nonverbal communication, that helps to reduce that anxiety disorder and that anxiety in order to help them to speak more successfully in the classroom. And lastly, I wish I had more time to speak about this, but childhood apraxia of speech, it means that the student has difficulty with what they want to say traveling from their brain to the mouth. The muscles aren't weak, however, the student may not be able to move the lips and tongue to produce speech. A lot of individuals with childhood apraxia of speech are nonverbal, and many individuals who are on the autism spectrum also have apraxia of speech. Student often knows exactly what they want to say, and they're able to write what they want to say, but the brain is unable to send the correct message so that the speech muscles can articulate what they want to say. Also, speech sounds are not learned in the same order as typically developing speakers. You will see very inconsistent productions. 1 minute, my student might say car, the next minute they might say tar, the next minute they might say towel. And it varies from point to point and from day to day and from minute to minute. And it's rarely something that you will see progress without treatment. You may see incorrect stress on sounds. You may see that kids are able to use shorter sounds, but then as words get longer and with more syllables, it's more difficult for them to produce. So some things you could do is very similar to some of those other disorders that were based on pressure, is that you create a stress-free environment. Oftentimes when they're thinking about the fact that they have to speak, it's not as easy. It's not as automatic. When speech comes out automatically, it's more successful for these kids. One thing you could do is encourage repetition. Think about when you learned how to type on a keyboard. The best way to train a motor plan, which is essentially what's going on here, their motor plan is disrupted. The best way to train a motor plan is to repeat that motor plan over and over and over again. And so this is one of those speech impairments that it is helpful to have repetition, but to speak with your speech path about how often and when. You will often see these students with severe apraxia of speech using an AAC device. You can also incorporate music and rhythm into your lessons, because that makes things more automatic, is to have that music and that rhythm. Pre-teach words and vocabulary that you'll be using in lessons. And remember that things that may have been difficult yesterday might be easy today, and vice versa, and it's not personal, that it really is just a matter of what the characteristics of this disorder include. They may need more support when participating in group activities, and allow children extra time to speak and encourage other kids and staff members to do so as well. We'll be talking more about augmentative and alternative communication next time, as augmentative and alternative communication is something that can help those individuals communicate, who have severe speech and language impairments. Just remember that what you do counts, what you think is important, and how you respond matters. And I thank you so much. I love speaking with you today, and I apologize that I had to rush through at the end. If there are any questions other than those that we do discuss right now, please feel free to email me. I'll be checking email, and I would love your questions and any comments that you'd have for me about what we talked about today. Go ahead, Tim. I don't think we have very much time for questions, but
that's okay. I did have a couple interesting ones. How can you tell or decide if an expressive language disorder, especially in written language, is more for the SLP or for the special education teacher?
That oftentimes can be determined through an evaluation. And so a lot of times there are tests that could really, especially in the mild categories of specific language impairment, or when you're looking at a learning disability, there are a lot of tests that can help weed those out. So I would refer you to those professionals on your team that could figure that out through their knowledge and through their assessments.